I've been reading Human Transit, the Revised Edition by Jarrett Walker, and obviously Human Transit is a great book, a bit of a transit planning bible as it were. And obviously if you haven't read it, you should. People often ask me for book recommendations, and this is my biggest book recommendation. But I think it's interesting to question some of the ideas around how you create the most successful possible system. Because there are a lot of real-life experiences that I've had that make me question some assumptions that run pretty wide in the transit industry. Particularly what's often considered a low-value transit service or feature. So let's talk about it. Welcome to RM Transit, where we talk about the little details that can make a big difference for public transit. There's an idea that I sometimes hear from transit professionals and advocates that transit agencies should only focus on running high value, or more typically high ridership services. Seriously, I hear this all of the time. Oh, those routes they don't really get riders. And the idea here is pretty simple. Some lines in a transit system are going to attract a lot of riders, and you would be foolish not to focus on those services. Sending limited resources elsewhere is just starving transit that's actually working. And to some extent, this makes sense. And to be fair, North American transit agencies aren't always the best at being efficient and prioritizing the most important services they provide. When your resources are insufficient, maximizing them is even more important. As Walker more or less says in the book, you can't have it all. And I think what's implicit in this is that trying to do a lot of things poorly is typically going to get you worse results than just doing a couple of things well. But at the same time, I think a narrow sense that we should only run high ridership routes is kind of dangerous, because that's shaped by your conception of high ridership, and as regular viewers of the channel will know, that's highly contingent on the level of service you provide. If you never actually run a good service on various routes, you aren't running the right experiments, and you might not actually ever discover where ridership demand actually exists. If I had $1 for every time someone told me that demand for a service that runs really infrequently and isn't all that convenient is low, I would have a lot of dollars. I think the attitude of focusing only on high-value interventions, services, or routes also creates problems at the macro level. It should be obvious that putting Wi-Fi on a bus or train that's slow and inconvenient isn't going to fix things. The problem there is obviously the transportation service. But I think we shouldn't take it as an accident that in many of the places where transit is best, there are a lot of non-core transit features that help make the experience a good one. Something is low value until it's not, and in places where transit tends to be a first choice for people and where they love the service, creature comforts tend to be pretty common. I think the core idea here is that if you plan a transit network only around cutthroat efficiency, you'll miss a lot of things that provide a lot of value, even if it isn't in terms of ridership or monetary value. And those things still matter because they might have a subtle impact on very important things, like how people feel about using transit and how it's perceived. A great example I can think of and that I've argued with people a lot about is the way transit vehicles look and how that can impact a system. If you look at transit in a purely analytical fashion, there's essentially no reason to make a bus or train look nice. An ugly bus or train can still have LCD screens and air conditioning, as North American viewers will know. And that's of course not to mention the fact that you can run frequent service with ugly vehicles. But if there's no ridership value, then why do trains in other parts of the world have crazy or cool designs? And for that matter, if design doesn't really matter, then why do car companies spend so much money creating complex designs and advertising them to people? Perception matters, and arguably in places where transit is a less common way of getting around, the perception matters even more. And that's because even if the impact is marginal and the cost to have a nice looking vehicle is higher, if you can just shift your mode share a couple of percentage points from mediocre to slightly less mediocre, that could be a huge amount of ridership you generate in a place where transit isn't all that commonly used. And the point of all of this is, again, not to suggest that how a train looks or whether it has Wi-Fi matters more than it running often. It's just that the value of these things is certainly not zero, and people are often not open enough to the fact that value might come in ways that they can't fully predict or understand. To get this across in terms of actual transit service and not just peripheral features or aesthetic considerations, I love the topic of night transit, which I've actually written a bunch of different articles about, which I will link in the description. The idea here is that night transit service is rarely very efficient. Vehicles tend to be pricier to run and less busy, so a lot of transit systems just don't really run night service. Japan is kind of famous for having trains which stop relatively early and basically no services during the night at all. If you get stuck out late in Japan, your transit solutions to get home are waiting until the first train starts running or calling a cab. And yet, many cities still run night services. In London, Berlin, and Melbourne, you actually even see rail services operating 24 hours on weekends. And of course in New York, they run 24 hours a week long. And this stuff might sound cool, but is it worth it? Well, personally, while I was living in Vancouver, the trains and buses, like in Toronto, operated frequently during the day. But as it turns out, Toronto's night buses and streetcars completely wiped the floor with Vancouver, and that stuff really matters. Literally the night before I'm recording this video, a friend from out of town came by my place at 11 p.m. And if I had been in Vancouver, we would have sat around and it would have been kind of boring. But because I'm in Toronto, we were able to go out for a trip around the city. Of course, I wouldn't have done this in Vancouver because I would know that if time got away from me, I would have a crowded and miserable night bus ride home, if a night bus went home at all. But in Toronto, I know when making the trip that at most I'll have to wait 15 or 20 minutes for a night bus, and maybe I'll have to walk a little longer, but I'll still be able to get home no matter what. And funny enough, I ended up catching the last subway train back at around 1:30 a.m., meaning I didn't actually ever step foot on a night service, and yet it provided a major benefit to me. If the night service didn't exist, the transit system would have lost out on 2 fares for both me and my friend. In that way, night service almost acts like a loss leader, giving people the comfort that they aren't going to have to pay for a super expensive cab ride or get stuck in the middle of the night for several hours. And while this is my favorite example, I can only imagine there are many more out there, and I'd love to hear yours in the comments. And I think this goes back to where we started. You can't only think about services in terms of their direct ridership value or cost, because transit is more complex than routes and mobility choices are contingent. A certain transit service might cost an agency a lot to operate, but if it makes people feel comfortable and they ditch their cars, they're going to be riding transit a lot more often, and the transit agency will ultimately benefit. Someone who's drawn in or even just comforted by some of the lower value services and features on transit might end up using the high value services a lot more often. Most transit people intuitively understand that just because a bus costs more to operate than it brings in fare revenue doesn't mean it should be eliminated. Ultimately, transit service rarely makes money, and that's okay because we accept that the cost that we have to pay for it, plus all of the benefits it provides, is worthwhile. I think we just need to use similar logic to look at these small details of transit systems. Whether that be low-value services like night buses that might make people ride more during the day, comfort features that make riding transit better no matter the circumstances, or aesthetic considerations that change the perception of transit and who's willing to even consider riding it. These things might not obviously be key in their own right, but like some transit routes, they might support a greater goal and provide value in ways we can't fully understand, allowing for something you could have never expected and unlocking dividends somewhere else. Thanks for watching.